In the winter of 1959, in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a search party climbed a frozen, wind-scoured slope and found a tent. It was half collapsed, buried in snow, and it was recognizable as the one belonging to a group of 9 hikers who had gone missing weeks earlier. The searchers had been looking for these people. They had hoped, the way searchers always hope, to find them cold and hungry and alive. Instead, they found the tent cut open. Not unzipped, not untied, cut, slashed through the fabric with a blade, and the cuts had been made from the inside. The 9 people were gone. Their boots were still there. Their coats were still there. Everything they needed to survive a night on that mountain was neatly inside the shelter they had torn open and abandoned, and their footprints led away downhill into a temperature that kills a barely dressed human being in hours. What happened to them in the dark between their last diary entry and their deaths has never been explained to everyone's satisfaction. Not by the Soviet investigators who filed the case and sealed it. Not by the scientists who reopened it decades later. Not by the families, some of whom went to their own graves still asking. Tonight we are going to walk into that story slowly. We are going to look at what is documented, at what was found, and at the questions that refuse to close. And at the center of all of it sits that one detail, the one that turns a tragedy into something that people still whisper about more than 60 years later, that whatever was out there in the cold, these 9 experienced people decided it was safer than whatever was inside the tent with them. The official conclusion, filed in 1959, blamed what the investigators called a compelling natural force. That phrase has haunted this case ever since. Because if the force was natural, why did they need a phrase that vague? And if it was something else, well, that is where the story stops being a report and starts being something else entirely. Let us begin with the people, because they matter, and because the temptation with a story like this is to forget that these were real human beings. The group was led by a young man named Igor Dyatlov. He was 23, a student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and by every account, a serious, careful, capable outdoorsman. This was not a group of tourists wandering into the wilderness on a whim. These were experienced ski hikers, most of them students or recent graduates, several of them veterans of harder expeditions than this one. The route they had chosen was rated at the highest difficulty category that existed in the Soviet hiking system at the time. Completing it would have earned them a certification. They knew what they were doing. There were 10 of them at the start. One member, feeling ill with joint pain, turned back early in the journey. That decision saved his life, and it left him to spend the rest of it as the man who almost died with his friends and instead had to bury them. He kept photographs. He kept memories. He was, in a sense, the first person to have to live inside the mystery. That left 9. They pushed on toward a mountain the local Mansi people called by a name that has since been translated in the retellings as something close to Dead Mountain. Whether that translation is accurate, or whether it grew more ominous with every retelling, is itself part of how this story works. The truth and the legend have been braided together for so long that pulling them apart is merely impossible. That is what happens to a story people cannot let go of. They kept diaries. This is one of the reasons the case grips people the way it does. We are not guessing at their mood or inventing their voices. They wrote things down, the group kept a shared diary, and several members kept their own. They photographed the journey. They joked, they complained about the cold and the weight of their packs. They were, in their own written words, ordinary young people on a hard trip, tired and happy, and entirely unaware that they were walking toward the last night of their lives. The final entries are dated the 31st of January. They describe setting up, digging in, dealing with wind. And then, on what would have been the 1st of February, they made a decision that investigators have argued about ever since. Instead of camping in the shelter of the tree line, lower down, out of the wind, They set up their tent on an open, exposed slope, high, bare, in the path of whatever the mountain wanted to send down at them. Why? The generous explanation is that Dyatlov did not want to lose the altitude they had gained. Dropping into the trees and climbing back up would have cost them time and effort. Staying high kept them on schedule. It is the kind of practical, slightly stubborn decision that experienced hikers make all the time, and almost always get away with. Because something happened on that slope in the dark, and whatever it was bad enough that 9 trained, equipped, capable people abandoned their only shelter and their only warmth and fled into a winter night on a mountainside, most of them without proper clothing, several of them without shoes. Now, everything strange about this case radiates out from that single fact. 9 people who knew better ran from safety into death. People do not do that for no reason. People with that much experience especially do not do that. So the entire mystery, every theory, every argument, every late-night forum thread is really just an attempt to answer one question. What could possibly have been inside that tent that was worse than what was outside it? Let's go to the search. When the group failed to return on schedule, there was a delay before anyone acted. Overdue expeditions were not unusual, and a few days of silence did not immediately alarm anyone. But as the days stretched on, the families began to press, and eventually a search was organized. Volunteers, students, and eventually the military and police became involved. They found the tent first, more than 3 weeks after that final diary entry. It was partially collapsed and buried in snow, but it was recognizable. And it was, from the very first moment, wrong. The tent had been cut open from the inside. This is not speculation. This is one of the few things in the entire case that investigators agreed on completely. The fabric showed cuts made by a blade, and the geometry of those cuts, the way the material tore and folded, indicated the knife had been used from within. Whatever drove these people out did not come through the entrance. They did not calmly unlace the flap and step outside. They slashed through the wall of their own shelter and went out into the storm. Most of their belongings were still inside. Their boots, their heavy coats, their equipment. Everything a person needs to survive a night in those temperatures was neatly where they had left it, while the people themselves had vanished into the dark in whatever they happened to be wearing when the panic hit. In some cases, that meant socks. In some cases, it meant less. From the tent, a set of tracks led downhill toward the tree line. 8 or 9 sets of footprints, preserved in the packed snow. And here is another detail that lodges in the mind and will not leave. The tracks did not look like the tracks of people running in blind chaos. They were, by several accounts, relatively orderly, walking, not sprinting, as if the group had left the tent in a hurry, but not in a stampede. As if they were fleeing something, yes, but fleeing it with some remaining thread of discipline, moving together, heading for the cover of the trees. The tracks led down about 1.5 miles to the edge of the forest, and there, near the remains of a fire they had tried to build under a large cedar tree, the searchers found the first of the bodies. 2 of them, near the fire, lying in the snow, stripped down to their underclothes. Branches on the cedar above them had been broken high up, as though someone had climbed it. To see? To reach wood? To look back at the tent? No one knows. The fire they had built was small and had not been enough. These 2, it appeared, had died of the cold. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar and the tent, spaced out along the line, as if they had been trying to go back. That is the detail that turns the stomach a little. 3 of them appear to have died while attempting to return to the shelter they had fled. Their positions, the direction they were facing, the distances between them, the reconstruction suggests they turned around and tried to fight their way back uphill into the wind, and did not make it. One of them was Igor Dyatlov himself, the leader, found partway back toward the tent, as if he had been the one trying to bring his people home. That was five. 5 bodies, and they told a story that was terrible, but not on its own impossible. Exposure, hypothermia, a group that panicked, fled, and froze. Awful, but the kind of awful that mountains have always been capable of. It was the last 4 that broke the case open and have kept it open ever since. Because the last 4 were not found for months. They were found only after the snow began to melt, buried in a ravine deeper in the forest, under a significant depth of snow, in the bed of a stream. And their condition was different. Let me be careful here, because this is where the story tends to run away from the facts, and the facts are strange enough without help. Several of these 4 had suffered major internal injuries. One had a fractured skull. Others had severe chest trauma, broken ribs, the kind of damage that, according to the medical examiner of the time, would require a force comparable to a car crash or a fall from a great height. And yet, and this is the part that has launched 1,000 theories, in some cases there was little or no corresponding damage to the skin above the injuries. The bodies were broken on the inside in ways that did not match the outside. How do you crush a person's chest without leaving a mark on the surface of their body? That question has never had an answer that satisfies everyone. And then there is the detail that everyone who tells this story eventually arrives at. The one that gets whispered, the one that gets exaggerated, the one that has probably done more than anything else to lift this case out of the realm of tragic accident and into the realm of the truly uncanny. Some of the bodies were missing soft tissue, eyes, in at least one case, a tongue. Now, here is where I have to slow down and be honest with you, because you deserve the real version, not just the scary one. The bodies in the ravine were the ones that had been exposed the longest, lying in and near running water for months before they were found. And forensic specialists, both in 1959 and in the decades since, have pointed out that soft tissues like eyes and tongues are exactly the tissues that decompose first, and that are most readily lost to water and to the natural processes of a body left in the wilderness. There is a mundane explanation for the missing tissue, and it is probably the correct one. But here is why the detail survives anyway, why it refuses to be explained away, no matter how many experts address it. It is because of the company it keeps. If you found a body in the wild with tissue loss, you would think nature. Sad, but ordinary. But when you find it at the end of this specific chain, the slashed tent, the fled and frozen friends, the crushing injuries with no external wound, the compelling natural force that the state could not or would not name, the ordinary explanation starts to feel like it is straining. Each piece has an answer. It is only when you lay them all in a row that the answers stop lining up. That is the real engine of the Dyatlov case. Not any single impossible thing. A pile of individually explainable things that together form a shape no one can quite name. So let us talk about the shapes people have tried to give it. The first, and the one that has gained the most ground in recent years, is the avalanche. Or more precisely, a specific and unusual kind of snow slab release. For a long time, the avalanche theory was dismissed because the slope was not steep enough for a classic avalanche. No obvious avalanche debris was found, and the tracks leading away from the tent did not look like people running from a wall of snow. But more recent modeling, including work that drew on the same physics used to animate snow in a certain famous animated film, which is a strange and true detail, proposed that a small, slab-shaped release of hard-packed snow could have slid down onto the tent in the night. It would not have buried them like a movie avalanche. It would have delivered a heavy, blunt blow. That could account for the crushing chest and skull injuries. It could explain why they cut their way out and fled. It could explain almost everything. Almost. Because the avalanche theory, elegant as it is, still leaves people cold. And not only because they want a monster. It leaves them cold because of the behavior. If a slab of snow injured several of your group and half buried your tent, would you abandon everything and walk 1.5 miles downhill into a killing wind without your boots, without your coats? Or would you dig out your gear, dig out your injured, and shelter in place? Experienced hikers, the argument goes, would not have run, and they especially would not have run in the strangely orderly way the tracks suggest, only to freeze in stages on the way down. The physics of the avalanche can be made to work. The psychology is harder. The second family of theories is the human one, the idea that they were not killed by the mountain at all, but by other people. This region of the Soviet Union in 1959 was not empty. There were prison camps not far away. There were military installations. There were rumors, always rumors, of secret weapons tests. The state was secretive by nature and by policy, and secrecy is the soil in which this kind of theory grows best. Some who hold this view point to the vagueness of the official conclusion, to the way the case file was reportedly restricted, to the presence of the military in the search, and ask a simple question. If there was nothing to hide, why did it feel so much like something was being hidden? They point to accounts, difficult to verify, of strange lights seen in the sky over those mountains around that time by other groups in the region. Glowing orbs, spheres of light. And they connect those lights to the idea of a test, a rocket, a weapon, something that came down out of the dark and did to those 9 people something the state could never admit. This is where the parachute mine theory lives, and the failed rocket theory, and a dozen variations. Something fell. Something detonated in the air, or on the slope. The overpressure from a blast could, in principle, cause internal injuries without external wounds. That is a real phenomenon, and it is one of the more chilling arguments in the whole case, because it is the one mechanism that actually fits that specific and horrible detail. A pressure wave crushes from the inside. It is the kind of injury you find in people caught near an explosion. Did that happen? There is no proof. There is a pattern of secrecy, a handful of reported lights, a conclusion worded strangely enough to invite suspicion, and a set of injuries that a blast wave would explain. Draw your own line through those points. People have been drawing lines through them for over 60 years, and no 2 people draw quite the same line. And then there are the other theories, the ones further out, the ones that treat Dead Mountain as a name that means something. The Mansi people were, briefly, suspected by investigators, and just as quickly cleared. There is no credible evidence that they had anything to do with it, and the suspicion says more about the investigators than about the Mansi. But the mountain's grim name gave the story a mythic frame that it has never shaken. Some retellings reach for the truly ancient, for something in the high, cold places that does not have a name in any modern language, something that the local traditions supposedly warned about, something that does not want to be photographed, and may, some say, be the dark shape smeared across frame 34. I am not going to tell you that is what happened. I do not believe I have the right to tell you what happened because I do not know, and neither does anyone else alive. That is the honest center of this entire story. 9 people died on a mountainside in 1959, and the truth went into the snow with them. But I want to come back, before we finish, to the thing that I think actually keeps people awake. It's not the monster. It's not even the missing tissue or the crushed chests. It's the tent. Sit with that. Everything they needed to live was in that tent. They were experts. They knew, better than almost anyone, that leaving shelter and warmth on a night like that was a death sentence, and they did it anyway. All 9 of them, together. They chose the storm over whatever was in there with them, or over whatever they believed was coming. Whatever it was in that moment, it was more frightening than dying of cold. And they were right to be afraid, because dying of cold is exactly what most of them did. What does that to 9 experienced people at once? What overrides that much training and that much survival instinct in every single member of a group simultaneously? A slab of snow, maybe. A sound in the dark. A light on the slope. A pressure they felt before they understood. Panic spreading faster than reason. We can list the candidates. We cannot choose between them. The Russian authorities reopened the case in recent years and landed officially on the snow slab explanation. For many people, that closed the book. For many others, it did not, because an official answer to a case this famous will always be met with the same suspicion that surrounded the original one. The people who want it to be an avalanche have their model. The people who want it to be a weapon have their lights and their silence. The people who want it to be something older have the mountain's name and the shape in the photograph. And the 9 themselves have their diaries, their smiling photographs from the good days of the trip, and a silence that no theory has ever fully filled. Frame 34 is still there. You can find it. Look at it, and you will see almost nothing. A dark smear, a wash of light, the last thing a camera recorded before its owner walked out into the dark and did not come back. Your mind will try to make it into something, a figure, a shape, a warning. That is what minds do with the last image before a mystery. They fill it in. The mountain is still there too. People hike it now, deliberately, because of what happened. They stand on the slope where the tent was pitched, and they look down the 1.5 miles of open ground toward the tree line, and they try to imagine running it in the dark, in the wind, in their socks, away from something, and then they go home, and they sleep in warm beds, and the mountain stays exactly where it is, holding whatever it knows. The site was disturbed, searched, dug over, and eventually left alone. The tent is long gone. The evidence has been argued into dust. What remains is the question, and the question is simple, and the question has no answer. 9 people ran from safety into death. Something made them do it. We still do not know what. If this is the kind of story that stays with you after the screen goes dark, the kind you turn over on the walk to your car, the kind you find yourself thinking about at the edge of sleep, then subscribe, because there is more of it coming. More cold places, more sealed files, more last photographs, more questions the official story was never quite able to close. The mountain does not care whether we solve it. It has waited this long. It can wait longer.